Hey everybody, happy Tuesday. Sean Gibbons from the Communications Network. Really grateful that you're with us. I see folks are still coming in the room. I'm going to just set the table for the conversation we're going to have today about an incredibly critical issue for all of us, internal communications. And that is the topic. It's best practices for internal communications at nonprofits and foundations. We're joined by a bunch of my friends. I'm grateful you guys are going to get a chance to learn from them. These are just among the best and brightest in our field, and they have been very, very gracious over the last year, doing a number of things to help us all think through how to do this work better. And they are Rebecca Chamberlain-Creanga from the Kresge Foundation up in just outside of Detroit in Michigan. Rodney Jordan, who until fairly recently was with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. He is now at McDonald's, just outside of Chicago, and prepping himself for, I think, his second winter out there. Sierra Selby, who is a National Urban Fellow, and Mike Smith, who is with the James Irvine Foundation out in San Francisco, where he will be one of our gracious hosts when we bring the Networks Conference out there next October. They are going to, over the next hour, talk to us about one of the most critical things to doing communication successfully, which is making sure that the folks that we work alongside, our colleagues, our bosses, our board, in many cases our partners, have a good idea of what we're doing and why. And the name we always apply to that seems to be internal communications. For many of us, this is something that we are fortunate enough to have people devoted to who think this stuff through. For others of us who work in maybe smaller shops, this is a piece of the work, and it is a critical piece. Particularly in this era that we live in now, where our colleagues are oftentimes telling the stories of what we're working on, whether that's at a cocktail party or on their Facebook page, and arming them and helping them understand in ways that are meaningful to them about what we're doing and how to be an ambassador for your organization and to tell the story and to be mindful of how their own work can intersect with the brand or the mission that you're trying to achieve is really, really critical. And look, the fact is there's ways to do this work well, and frankly, there's some places where we're all experiencing some pain points so that we may see some challenges, and that's what we're going to talk about over the next hour. We're going to discuss the 3 pillars of an effective internal communications framework. We're going to talk about some of the common challenges that all of our organizations face when it comes to internal communications. And we're also going to look a little bit at some of the findings and lessons from a report on how corporations and nonprofits are approaching smarter communication. So what's new and what's ahead for all of us, things that we should all be thinking about. Okay, just before I hand it over, a couple quick logistical items. Many of you have been here with us before, so you all know this. We have a full house. There's about 175 of us in the room right now. Grateful for that. That means there's a lot of people who probably are coming in with questions. We're going to try to get to as many of them as we can, and we'll have a couple of points along the way where we'll pause to take your questions. We're also going to have, you can use your chat box down the lower left-hand corner. If you're not familiar with this technology, look in your lower left-hand corner and you'll see participant feedback or something like that. You can type in there, send the message in. We'll be keeping an eye out. And we will be taking questions at a couple different points in the presentation. And those that we don't get to, these folks have all graciously agreed to join us in the members community afterwards. So if you have a question, you can always post it we didn't get to. Feel free to post it in there, and Rebecca and Mike, I know, are willing to hop in and take a few of those on for you. We're also on Twitter, as we do nowadays, so you can use the hashtag ComNetLive. That's COMNETLIVE. Use that and go ahead and send us some questions, or if you're making notes along the way for your friends and colleagues, we're always grateful to see that happen. As always, we will be recording, or we are recording this webinar, and we'll be posting it up online at comnetwork.org for free replays, so feel free to share it with your friends or have a watch party after the fact with maybe some colleagues. Thanks again for joining us. I'm going to hand it off to Rebecca, Rodney, Sierra, and Mike, and I think, Mike, we're going to start with you.
Great.
Why don't you take it away?
Great. Thanks, and hello, everyone. I just wanted to show the agenda here and give a quick overview, where we'll do a quick overview of the conversations to date, how we got here. We'll touch on the framework that Sean mentioned of internal communications, then the findings from some interviews that Sierra did. We'll have 2 different opportunities for Q&A, and in between that, we'll share some of the tips that we have ourselves and that we've heard from many of you as we've had some of these conversations over the last year. I wanted to start, though, since I watched a lot of movies in the 80s, with the 1987 John Hughes movie, Some Kind of Wonderful, which had a common formula to it. Boy wants girl, boy pursues girl, he gets girl, then he realizes he's been wasting his time and missing out because the right girl is right there and was his best friend. That's the woman on the right, far right. So, in the end, of course, everyone's happy. But I think about this often with internal communications because it's the same a lot of times here for us. For me, for example, Director of Communications for a foundation that's focused on California, internal communications is not part of my official job, but it certainly comes up and is important for a lot of reasons. We spend a lot of time, there's a lot of time and pressure thought about external strategies for sort of external audiences, but employees are sort of trusted, willing messengers that are sort of right there at arm's length that we often don't think about. We don't communicate to or through, the same with board and other sort of close stakeholders that we have. So we wanted to share like sort of how we got here, which was Rodney and I did a session at the Detroit ComNet event last year. It was a packed room, really well attended. We realized how much interest there was in this. It was interesting for he and I to team up because, again, it wasn't my full-time job. For Rodney at Gates it was, and it continues to be now. So there's a range of sort of time and focus that different people will have on this issue. And then after that meeting, Rebecca from Kresge was really engaged in the meeting and came up afterwards and wanted to continue the conversation because, as we know, shorter sessions like these don't always give us the opportunity to really dig deep and get at strategies and tips that we can really share with each other to use in our own working lives. She very nicely summarized that session in a blog post on ComNet that you can find. And then that led us to Miami this year, where I'll hand it over to Rebecca for continuing how we got here.
Absolutely. Thanks, Mike. So just to keep this conversation going on internal communications, because as we looked around, more and more people had questions, had ideas. And so we thought, let's organize an informal breakfast chat at the ComNet 17 session in Miami. And just to give a shout out, it was a privilege to partner with RJB from Hadaway Communications on that. So thank you to RJ. And the session, really, it was just a great chance to think about how we can bring an internal comm lens or sensitivity to kind of our everyday communications work. As Sean kind of opened up, for many of us in nonprofits and foundations, we all wear many, many hats in our organizations. And so then the question is, what does it look like to put on this hat of internal comms? So kind of to answer that question, we framed up the session around three main elements or outcomes to internal communications. And that was something that was highlighted in our previous ComNet blog and really Mike and Rodney focused on in ComNet in Detroit. And we made the session very participatory, allowing all participants to surface in small groups their questions or challenges, solutions, ideas around these three areas to internal comms. To explain more, though, about these three areas of internal comms, I want to introduce and hand it over to Rodney. We like to call Rodney our guru of internal comms of all of us. He has years and years of expertise and experience in the field, and he really brought us this framework around these three outcomes to internal comms. So it's my pleasure to turn it over to him to explain more about this.
Hey, thanks so much, Rebecca. And it's always a bit nerve-wracking when someone introduces you as a guru because then you have to live up to that expectation. I think what you all will see is that after Sierra presents, she will be the newly anointed guru of internal comms, especially as it relates to the nonprofit space. But the framework you see here around org alignment, employee engagement, and brand ambassadorship, why this framework? This is now organization number 4 that I've worked in throughout my career. So I've worked at UPS, I've worked at Coca-Cola Enterprises, the Gates Foundation, and now McDonald's. And one of the things that I have noticed is that across all of those organizations, the challenge has been internal communications has a tendency to look different. And as I reflected back on each of those experiences, I wanted to put a framework together that really spoke to, that gave some consistency to what does it mean when you say internal comms? How can you take it out of the nebulous and make it something that's more tangible and outcomes-based? So in thinking about what you can truly achieve in terms of internal communication strategy, landed on these three outcomes of alignment, engagement, and ambassadorship. And the utility around this is that when you know what you're trying to achieve, you know then what you need to build. And if you're building a function from a comms perspective that is trying to achieve alignment, what you're doing is focusing on getting everyone to go in the same direction. People have clarity and understanding of the direction and the vision of an organization so they can go in the same direction. If something is really trying to drive engagement, it's about building connection and commitment to that organization and to that vision. And there are strategies that you put in place in order to do that. And then lastly is brand ambassadorship. So this is about having a focus on amplifying the mission of your organization. How do you get the people who are most connected to that organization to really tell the story about it and get the narrative out there amongst everyone that they know? And so that's really what are three things that you can achieve in measurable, tangible ways from an internal communications perspective. I'm using this framework even now as I've started to build out a new capability here at McDonald's. Use it at the Gates Foundation in the nonprofit space. And as Mike and Rebecca mentioned, we use this to frame up the conversation at ComNet, not this previous year, but the one prior. So with this framework in mind, as fate would have it, Sierra reached out to me and when as she was starting her fellowship and said, hey, I'm looking for a research project to do internal communications for my organization, and I just want to chat with you and learn more about the space and figure out how those learnings can apply for nonprofits. And so she's gone and done some really fantastic research and done some great interviews with some peers and colleagues, and I think has some learnings that are going to really be helpful for you all wherever you are on your journey of building or advancing or evolving your internal communications capacity. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our speaker of the whatever hour, 45 minutes or whatever is left, over to Sierra.
Thank you, Rodney, for that introduction. As Rodney mentioned, I really connected with him when it came to really finding out some of the basics of internal communications, because at the moment I was fulfilling a fellowship as well as conducting a thesis research project on the topic of internal communication. So how my topic kind of evolved was looking at those practices and activities and perspectives of those who were involved in internal communications in companies, and really looking at that as somewhat inspiration for the work that I was doing at a nonprofit. So I'll be talking to you guys about those findings and about some of those lessons learned. And what I would like to ask from you guys is really to be thinking about how we can apply this information towards, what is effective and what might be effective in our own organizations, as well as how does this inspire us as internal comms leaders in the work that we do every day. So I'll start with telling you guys a little bit about myself. I'm a National Urban Fellow graduate, which is a program out of New York City and whose mission is to develop and train people of color and women to be leaders in the public and nonprofit sector. And one of the major components of this program actually enables fellows to do work with nonprofits across the U.S. For 9 months on a variety of issues and causes based on the needs of that organization. So what that meant for me was helping a health research institute in Washington, D.C. by the name of PCORI with implementing an internal communication strategy. And for those of you who don't know what PCORI is, they fund health research, and they really bring patients, doctors, researchers into the same conversation about the best health outcomes. And there are 250 employee organizations, so I was helping out of the Office of the COO with internal communications. So I'm really excited about speaking to you guys today about my master's research findings. And last but not least, the random fact about me is that I'm really passionate about volunteering and community service. I also lead a few community mural projects in the Georgia area. So for the next 7 minutes or so, I'll be talking to you about the research, which we'll start right now. So initially, my research topic was best practices for internal communications, looking at what nonprofit organizations can learn from for-profit companies in regard to 3 things. And those are the understanding of the value of internal communications, the strategic internal partnerships that are built within those companies, and the tools and channels that they use to maintain internal effectiveness. So the purpose of this research really was to uncover those best practices as well as the perspectives of those company leaders who lead those internal communication functions every day. And the meat of my research came from the narratives I was able to collect from conducting these interviews with these internal comms leaders. So I did interview internal comm leaders from companies to include Direct Energy, General Electric, ADP, and Deloitte. And just gathering those perspectives really helped me to generate a diverse set of views in what it is I was asking about. So out of those 11, I asked 11 questions to interviewees. And out of those 11 questions, the 2 that I will be discussing with you today that somewhat align with some of those internal comms pillars that Ronnie mentioned are: why is internal communications important to your company? How has internal communications contributed to their overall organizational effectiveness? And last but not least, I'll visit a few lessons learned from doing research as well as firsthand experience at the organization PCORI with internal communications. So the first question I asked internal comm leaders was, why is internal communications important? And some commonalities between their responses included that, it really helped with engaging employees. It had a positive impact on their company's bottom line, and it led to employees understanding the mission and strategy of the company better. So as I'm hearing these perspectives, what's ringing in my head and how I'm kind of translating this is, what does some of this translate to someone like me? How does that sound to someone who's actually doing this type of work at a nonprofit? So very similar to companies, there was a stress and importance in ensuring employees felt connected and committed to their organization's mission, their goals, and their values, and it motivated employees to contribute to the organization's overall success. And when looking at how internal comms was important when it came to having, a positive impact on the bottom line, how this translated for nonprofits is that, it has a positive impact on the organization's overall mission and strategic goals. And this can mean something like, retaining employees or having a better relationship with the board or, just having overall more effective and successful fundraising activities. And lastly, the importance of, having internal communications, which it leads to employees understanding the goals and strategy of the company better. I really saw this as employees understanding their role and the work that they do every day is somewhat contributing to the mission, right? And as well as somewhat contributing to efforts outside of their job description that they can take and steps that they can take to contribute to the organization's overall success. So at my organization, PCORI, which I mentioned earlier, the organization was really thoughtful about incorporating activities around organizational alignment and professional growth. So within their performance evaluation process, they utilize a set of cultural attributes expectations called AIM. And some of you may be familiar, but for those of you who aren't, this is a framework used to measure how employees conducted themselves during the fiscal year. So if I were to break down the acronym, accountable would stand for the A, which means to take full ownership for full quality work and timeliness while being a prudent steward of PCORI's resources. The I would stand for inspired, which meant that employees were demonstrating a strong commitment to PCORI's success and felt somewhat energized towards sharing a shared vision with others in the organization. And last, it would be the M would stand for mission-driven, which meant that through employee actions and efforts, they demonstrated absolute clarity to the overall purpose of their organization. So the next question I asked interviewees, was how internal communications contributed to the organizational effectiveness. So interviewees indicated the following as spaces where internal communications really helped improve their organization. And that was change communications, bringing creativity to the workforce, and connecting leadership to employee outcomes. So again, what I'm doing as I'm conducting this research is translating how this would be and what this looks like to someone doing this type of work in a nonprofit organization. So very similar to companies, change communications meant helping employees understand how a change is happening and how it relates to their own experience. So this becomes really helpful when nonprofits are doing and conducting changes with their employee structures, when nonprofits are experiencing mergers, and things that really affect the change, affect employees when organizations are experiencing change. Secondly, which is one of my favorites, is that it brought creativity to the workforce, right? So it encouraged employees to include creative approaches into their everyday busy working practices, so enable them to think outside of the box when thinking about the work that they do every day. And lastly, it connected leadership to employee outcomes. So it allowed leadership to share their visions and values with employees, and it allowed them to really understand how they could prioritize and support the internal communication activities and efforts happening throughout the organization. So at the core, many issues that employees felt were important were discussed at what we called executive visiting sessions. And this I actually saw as a really unique twist to the executive listening session. So in addition to executives inviting, a diverse group of staff to one session to discuss very important topics, staff groups and departments periodically invited leadership to their own department and work group meetings to discuss issues that were important to them. So there was more of a focus there, and leadership were able to catch on to that at those sessions. So last but not least, I'll be discussing some pretty random but really impactful lessons learned that I pulled from really having these unique conversations with these internal comms directors and managers at these companies, and from, just involving myself in the everyday activities at my organization when it came to really improving internal communications there. So first, I learned that internal communication should really incorporate everyone's communications needs. I believe it's almost pivotal to figure out what's important to departments and people who represent organizational functions individually, and then to work towards a shared strategy and mission. And at Pecori, we were really intentional about working with every function and hearing everyone's voices to understand their own individual goals and priorities and how we can incorporate that into what we were doing with internal communication. And secondly, I really think that we could all probably agree to the fact that with internal communications, things change pretty frequently. So because these needs change often, especially given that technology is constantly evolving and new software and new practices and frameworks are being developed, it's okay to try new activities until you find what works best for your organization and what makes the best fit for your employees. And last but not least, I learned that companies with effective communication strategies are usually successful. So I didn't see a downside to investing in effective communications for your organization, just as companies do for their companies. I believe that a better communicating workforce, bottom line, leads to positive outcomes. And that is it for my piece of the presentation. Thank you guys again for listening, and I'll turn it over to Sean, who will be assisting with our Q&A. Thanks, guys.
I think we got some questions here. I don't know, Sean, are you going to step in and moderate? might be on mute if you're reading them. All right, well, maybe we'll just jump in to some of these that we're seeing here that people are chatting. This is Mike here, and I'll read the question and then let anyone who on our side answer that has it. One question is, what resistance have any of us encountered to implementing changes to internal communications processes, and how did you get buy-in from everyone at the organization? I'll say one thing about it, and then I'm sure Rodney and Rebecca and Sierra might have other things to say. One thing I'm buying that definitely there usually is resistance. I think sometimes people feel like very basic communication, like, oh, we already told staff this or explained this to this department. They don't realize how much, just like in the outside world, repetition is important, and people don't get things the first time they hear it, and they may also not agree, so you have to figure out how to navigate that. I think there's buy-in from leadership for sure that you want to do, but there's also, I find, really important when buy-in from other influential people in the organization. That we all know staff that they may not be on the management team, but they are very connected to other staff. They talk a lot. They're respected, or whatever it might be. So there's also a strategy, I think, of identifying influencers that you want on a subcommittee or a task force or working group that can also be very influential in furthering sort of ideas or messaging or idea processes you might be considering. So I'll let anyone else jump in on that question.
Yeah, on the resistance part, Mike, and I think, so one thing for people to know too is I think we've got 2 or 3 slides of best practices and tips that Mike and Rebecca are going to walk through. But there are ways to actually quantify engagement, alignment, and ambassadorship. The first 2, the engagement and the alignment ones, if your organization does some sort of employee commitment survey or employee engagement survey, there's data in there that will answer the questions and show how engaged an employees are, or how much they understand the direction and vision. If you don't have a formal survey that's being done, you can go into SurveyMonkey and do a create a free survey that pulses the organization to see check their knowledge and understanding of the direction of the organization, and that data will show either the need for more alignment or opportunities to be a little bit clearer on what that strategy is. So what I would say is let data be your friend. You can create some data that shows where the organization is misaligned or where employees who work there don't feel as connected as they should be, and that will create the opportunity to build a communication strategy. The second thing I would say, Sierra mentioned on her slide change communications and how impactful those can be for an organization. Whenever there's something, a shift in terms of a restructure or a change in strategy or a change in mission that the organization is going to do, those are times when it's critical to communicate that effectively to the people who work there. And so but just communicating the change happening and not continuing to talk about it won't make the change land effectively. So if your organization is about to do something different than it's done before, make a big change, that's a chance to come in and say, hey, it's important that we make sure people understand this. So it gives you a window to enter into doing internal communications when there's a change. So 2 things. Create some data using a survey, like a SurveyMonkey or something, to see how well people understand the vision and direction. And then 2, if there's a change that's happening, you can always use present communications as a critical tactic to help the change land effectively.
All right, everyone. Let's go to another question, just being mindful of time. Maria asks, I'd be interested to hear what technologies people on the call are using for internal communication. So are there any go-to channels? I guess maybe Maria's asking about things like Slack or Google Groups, things of that nature.
I wonder actually if we should go through the next 3 slides, which are actually pretty quick, because then we touch on some of these things, and then let's just finish it off with nothing but Q&A at the end. So I'll go ahead and advance here and dive into that, if people can just be patient with that. So one set of tips that a lot of which came out of Sierra's work, which was in building the foundation for an internal communications plan. Take an organizational inventory. What internal communication practices exist or don't exist? How would you rate yourselves? The Survey Monkey idea that Rodney mentioned. We touched a little bit on buy-in just now in my response. And then create an actual plan for it, just like you would an external communications plan, or make part of your department's plan, an element of it related to internal communications. So I'll go to the next slide for Rebecca.
Absolutely, sure. So this next set of practical tips is really all about creating space for employee engagement. And I want to note that a few of these recommendations actually came out of our ComNet Miami session. So I alerted some of you folks who participated that we would be highlighting a few of them. And I hope some of you are on the call. And if you are, feel free to jump in and chime in and share more as I speak. So to share 2 tips, I'm going to focus on knowledge sharing and, if I have time, lunch and learns. And I think both will tackle some of the questions I'm seeing in the participant feedback. So the first is knowledge sharing. So knowledge sharing can sometimes be about collegiality, and it's all about having fun and connecting with your fellow colleagues. And platforms like Yammer are very effective in that, or Facebook's Workplace platform are things that are increasingly being used. And Rodney can correct me, but I think that Gates has moved towards using Workplace, and we've been looking into that. Some platforms that help you to get work done. So sometimes knowledge sharing is just how to work with a whole bunch of people doing different things. And platforms like Slack and Trello are very effective with that. To give an example, at my organization, I manage an internal newsletter, and we have many contributors and inputs. And so we've used Trello as an effective way to kind of streamline that work. A second thing I'll go over is lunch and learn. So this is just a way to build staff engagement and share and learn what each other are doing. And one thing, an idea that came up in our lunch and learns was around doing TED Talks. Doing TED Talks, say, during a lunchtime in a series, and just using it to engage employees who don't always get a chance to speak out at the organization. A big element to bear in mind is that lunch and learns, they do require choreography. They require infrastructure to be effective and to be sustainable. And something that I'm doing right now, I'm in the process of trying to think through and build out an infrastructure for our lunch and learns that we do in our organization.
Great. Can you continue on, Rebecca?
Oh, go right ahead.
Yeah, great. Okay, so the next slide, one of the things you'll see I often say is think improv, not Shakespeare, when it comes to sort of messaging for staff and the board. I think one of the biggest problems that organizations make, communicators actually make, is we do a lot of messaging work in writing. We write it down, that's how we get it out. But then that doesn't really translate to how people talk. And so then organizations feel like their staff and board and others can't actually communicate what the organization does, or a big change that the organization went through, or a new process. So you really have to, similar to the advice from the speechwriter at the ComNet conference, you really have to think about how people talk and read out loud what you're writing and make it as short as possible and give them concepts, not scripts. The other thing I would say is something from this slide that has been very helpful here at Irvine, because we announced a big change in our sort of focus last year, is right when I joined, is using new employee orientations is a chance, as new people come on board, you can use that time not only to give them information, give them messaging, but also set the expectation that, the communications department is going to be in touch with staff regularly. It's that we're a resource and also a provider of information to further our message and mission. So that's a good way to set that expectation. And then I'm glad, it sounds like Craig has a great newsletter. I found in some organizations taking it off newsletter, which people think they don't have to read, and making it come from someone in the executive team with short updates sometimes, quote unquote, tricks people into reading the information we need them to know about the organization. So with that, since there's so many nice questions pouring in, let's move to the next set of Q&A, and we'll just go from there. And Sean, do you want to moderate or?
Yeah, I apologize to everybody on the call. If you heard us go dark for a minute, I have proved that I am still got two left feet when it comes to technology. I booted us off the call. We have a number of questions, so let's get to them. Sasha asks, since the examples so far that we've heard of from, I think this is specifically speaking to Sierra's work, have come from large companies like Deloitte or General Electric, what lessons can be applied to smaller organizations that may be, say, less than 25 employees, which have significantly different challenges? Anyone want to take a swing at that? What's different between, say, a McDonald's and perhaps the Irvine Foundation?
I can one thing I'll pipe in right here and say is that I think the smaller organization actually has the expectations around communicating internally are higher, and I think the opportunities to communicate more frequently are higher as well. Unless, of course, everyone's scattered out across the globe, you probably have opportunities to bring people together more frequently. And so I think people like routine. And so if you have some standard touch points for weekly meetings, monthly town halls, those sorts of things, those are opportunities where you can have a standard agenda of things that you're covering off on, and there's less complexity in trying to make sure 25 people know what's going on as opposed to the thousands. And so I think that I would say don't overcomplicate it. If you have a smaller organization, put the onus on trying that sample size. You really could put set a goal for yourself to make sure that all 25 or less really understand what's happening and are consistently informed, and don't cloud it with a lot of process or tons of platforms, because I don't think you need it. But that's my 2 cents. I don't know, Mike, maybe if you have something to add on that.
No, I won't. I know we have a lot more questions, so I won't add too much more. I mean, I do think it's the blessing and a curse of like a small organization, because you have more access to those folks, but there's that side staff's probably busy. For example, the communications person probably is not just focused on internal communications. They're running around focused on lots of other things. So how do you carve out time in their and other people's schedules to achieve some of these things without competing with their sort of core responsibilities across the week?
Okay, let's do another one. Sandra asks, any specific tips on communicating with board members? Considering that they lack time, what are they most likely to, what's most effective with them? When it talks to talking to your board or collecting information from your board, either or, talking to them or listening to them.
I can share an example. So I'm happy to dive in with something that we're doing at Kresge. So we've reinstituted a monthly newsletter of various, so we have our own weekly external newsletter that goes over various highlights, but we also collect a monthly newsletter, and it's focused on various readings, mostly op-eds, things that relate to the work that we do. And it's a way to share with the board kind of the things that our leaders are reading, our staff are reading, and we always also make an effort. We first of all share it with the board, but we also circulate it with all staff so they can look at this list of various articles that are hot topics right now, and that it's good to be reading these. So that's an idea of how we stay in touch with them, how we share thought leadership and ideas with them, as well as communicate that back with our entire staff.
Okay, Anne asks, one major challenge for my organization is what she calls the silo effect. That is, groups are getting similar messages, but there are still trust issues between different departments. Oh, that never happens, does it? I'm just kidding, man. Do you have any suggestions for bringing people together from different departments or different job functions across the organization? So how do you get your HR folks talking to your program folks, as a for instance? Anyone want to weigh in on that?
Yeah, sometimes these aren't necessarily communications challenges. I mean, challenges around trust. I mean, there's communication can help reinforce trust as a value, but this comes to culture, and some things that organizations do to get people to work across silos is they actually form cross-functional working teams to attack big problems. So, something, for instance, around reputation or around, onboarding or around one of the missions that, typically there's multiple sides to this. And so what you can do from a comms perspective is maybe convene all the different sides of that are connected to the project and engage them in dialogue on trying to solve the problem together so that they understand the different pieces of it. And it starts to demonstrate the importance of working across silos because everyone has information that helps the other person to advance their work. So, in that case, communication can be a bit of a convener, but I don't know that it's necessarily a communication problem.
Okay, Tom asks, what are the pros and cons of having internal communications concentrated in the human resources or communications versus making it part of everyone's job description? And I guess the question would be, is that an either or? Is internal communications the responsibility of the comms team? Is it an HR function? Does it reside with leadership, or is this something that's shared across the organization? Rebecca, how do you guys think about it?
Yeah, so happy to answer that. So originally when I came into Kresge, I was working around strategy and evaluation. So I worked in international development. I have an evaluation background. But one of the projects I was given when I first came to Kresge was to do an assessment of our internal communications. And I love doing kind of this strategic research. So I did a lot of internal stakeholder interviews. And through that, came up with a number of recommendations. And out of that actually grew my position. We decided that we actually needed someone to own, to be able to say basically to be in charge of some of the areas that we felt we wanted to develop in. And a lot of my work, it's not just working with HR, a lot of it is creating links and ties with our program staff around lunch and learns, with the rest of our foundation. It cross-cuts every way. And I know Kresge, we are a kind of a medium-sized foundation. We're over 100 now. We're now as large as Gates, maybe larger than Irvine. So we had that luxury to create this position. But I do believe in some of the things that you need to build, for example, to build space for engagement, say through lunch and learns, or we at Kresge have a weekly staff meeting with our president, CEO, where he engages all of staff. We do a lot of cross-functional, cross-disciplinary teams through staff retreats, through diversity, equity, inclusion work, where HR folks are working with program staff on a weekly basis. And through those things, you need someone to coordinate. You need someone to create an infrastructure. And it doesn't have to be someone with an internal comms title, but it should be someone, whether that person is between communications or HR or somewhere, someone has ownership over creating that infrastructure, creating that choreography to really be intentional. I think the secret of internal comms is intentionality.
Can I just throw in one other thing, which is not really advice for that question, but this is something I've noticed over time, which is there's this thing where there's often communications can be helpful in how to message something from HR or another department to the rest of the staff or externally, and you want that expectation or that partnership so that you feel like the messaging is aligned and effective and all that. Sometimes it's interesting because then they get so used to it that they start coming to you for things that they can actually do themselves. So it's like coming up with the boundaries and sort of when is it fine you can write a letter and send that out or an email versus when do you really need communications to step in to craft something. So that's a challenge to that, but setting up sort of expectations with who does it and in what situations is one way to try to address it.
And how I'm going to put you on the spot. How do you guys manage that at Irvine? Who takes the pen, to quote from Sarah Hurwitz, most of the time? Is it something you guys pick up?
I think there is an internal expectation with HR and some other departments that I will be involved. And the involvement may be as little as they give me an update and I say I don't have any advice on that or don't need to participate, or maybe let's really work in partnership on that. I have some ideas on what we say and how we get it out. So I think it just starts with the knowledge that, hey, come down and talk to me about what might be an internal or external announcement of some kind, and then it sort of depends case by case on what level of involvement it is. So we have 50 staff, so it's not unmanageable in that way. I think as you get bigger, that might be a different story.
So Mike, this question I think is going to start with you, but my guess, Rodney, is you'll have a few ideas on this as well. Payal asks, our nonprofit is growing to include a new location with new staff, and we have no internal communications program, and would like to start one. So the question is, where should we begin? What's the number one most important thing to start with? And Mike, I know that at Irvine you have offices in both San Francisco and Los Angeles, so I imagine that's not an uncommon thing with so many of us now teleworking or working from a distance. How do you create proximity when your colleagues aren't necessarily living right down the hall?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's the third time now that I've worked somewhere where we've had sort of a main office and then a smaller office, and that office always feels sort of like the sort of stepchild that's ignored or not given all the information. I think one thing we've tried to do here and in other places is one, you definitely want to hear what their needs are, what their experiences are. How do they experience the information that they do or don't get from the main office? And that includes here at Irvine, several of us on the leadership team try to go down and regularly not only go down to the Los Angeles office, but actually do video conferencing that we do with all staff. That's one, technology is nice now that there's some really good video conferencing tools that can connect people via video at least. But doing it, even just sitting and seeing how they experience our staff meeting from LA and things like that can help us make tweaks to how we do things so that they get it. There's also a checklist that we have. If there's anything happening, information up here, what does LA need for it? Do they need printouts? Does someone there need to get food if we're having food here? Even small things just to make it feel like the same experience. So there's a checklist of things we try to think about for our colleagues down there. And again, just regularly having our IT department talk to them about the technology that is and isn't working to connect them, and other suggestions they have for how they get information.
So Elizabeth has a question. Oh, actually, before we get into Rodney, I know obviously McDonald's is a very dispersed company. Is there any ways that you guys tackle that challenge?
Yeah, and putting on a hat of a smaller scale and size. I mean, three things I would say is, one, never underestimate the power of a really effective onboarding. So I might throw all of my eggs in the basket of get onboarding correct, because that's going to set the culture. It's going to give people the broadest overview of what's happening at the organization. It's going to make sure people are meeting the right people, and so that their first entree into the organization is solid. The second thing is, I love Mike's example of using technology. I would even say if there's multiple offices, have the leadership team, if they're going to get everyone together at some point, and don't always do it from the home office. Broadcast from one of the other offices. So in that example, broadcast from LA, and let people in the other office view so that everyone is experienced, so you're kind of sharing the wealth. And then the last thing is I would use video as much as possible. I mean, in terms of with Google Chat and FaceTime and maybe Skype, but definitely with Google Chat, really get people into a habit. This is a part of onboarding of saying we like to use video to do conference calls and things. So it creates more connectivity, and it breaks down some of those barriers around distance.
I'm gonna take the privilege of asking a question for whoever wants to swing at it. how do you all manage internal communications and sort of the hour-to-hour, day-to-day? How are employees talking to one another? Of course, you can walk down the hall, and obviously email, I'm sure, is a very, very popular method. But are any of you exploring Slack or GChat or other things so that folks have the ability to knock on someone's door without necessarily having to walk down the hall or pick up the phone or, God forbid, use the email? What other technologies are people practicing or exploring? Maybe I'll start with Rebecca.
Yeah, I'm happy to start. So right now we are trying to use Skype. So you can use Skype for Business to have a chat functionality. To be honest, this is the first organization I've been in where I haven't had some form of messenger, but we're doing a broad sweep of growth in our IT department, and again, that's something that our communications and internal comms, we're partnering a lot with IT and thinking about how to roll that out and what we need. But right now we're experimenting with Skype for Business and its chat functionality, so we'll see how that goes.
Anybody else, Mike or Rodney?
Yeah, I mean, I think, for a staff of 50, email isn't, or walking down the hall isn't an overwhelming task, but I do think we use Yammer for a lot of basically it's like our intranet almost, where we try to move a lot of things that aren't sort of mission critical or that everyone needs to get. So there's a lot of all staff emails that have been moved to Yammer, as well as groups. You can have specific groups for different people on different topics. So some of the initiative teams here do that so they can really share articles and do other things like that. We just switched over to Zoom, which has been amazing, including a green screen so I can put up Star Wars images behind me whenever I need to. So I would really encourage people to look up Zoom as a video conferencing thing that's worked out great for us. And then we have things like using Salesforce Foundation Connect. There's you can chat within that, so the grant making teams can really go crazy within that system on just that topic.
Okay. Erin has a question. She says, what innovative internal comms tactics have you all seen? Something that caused any of you to sort of stop for a moment and go, wait a minute, we should be doing that, or that's a fantastic idea, we should explore it. I'll pick on Rodney. Anything out there that you saw really just blown your ears back a little bit?
Yeah, so I heard an interesting definition of innovative maybe 2 weeks ago, and it said that in the climate where we are now with technology, et cetera, innovation is much more about doing things better. And so one of the things I've been thinking about is how do we get better at creating content and in more cost-effective ways? It seems like there's so many great stories out there, and I think most of the people on the call probably say, oh, we have all these stories that we want to tell, or we've gone on these different visits and found all these great stories. How do we get better at using that and not spending thousands and thousands of dollars on making videos? And so one of the best practices that was mentioned earlier was doing an internal TED Talk. Quite frankly, there's ways to capture those on video now using an iPhone or an iPad. And what people are doing is that they are then taking that content and using it externally. They're putting it on their websites. They're putting it on their social media channels in little short clips as a way of, positioning themselves as thought leaders, as showing people what the inside of the organization. So it helps with transparency. It also helps to from an employer branding perspective in terms of if you're trying to recruit and attract talent. And the cost around those things is negligible because you're using technology that you have. So that's what I've been seeing a lot of lately is people really breaking down the walls between what they think is internal and external and saying, let's leverage the stories that we have inside the organization to communicate those externally and take and actually be the content that we want to represent either our organization or our mission.
Anybody else? Innovative approaches. I love the TED Talks thing. It feels like it works, has so many ancillary benefits, including obviously offering your leadership or folks who are participating reps at getting good at doing presentations and media training. Other approaches that people have seen that they've thought, wow, that really is interesting and something that we ought to be putting in the hopper at our own shop. Mike, anything you've seen that really?
I think similar to the sort of like the TED Talk thing is in video, like that's like a format thing. I think that's similar to I think it's more like different ways people experiment with just getting the information we in a week to week to have to get out to organizations and our staff. So it's like instead of the long sort of email or memo or the dry presentation at staff meeting, like just people being creative in how they do it, whether it's humor or teaming up with people in the staff meeting to sort of create like a skit to get across information. That just stuff gets their attention and sticks more and involves more people than the one person from management that gets up and prattles on about it.
Yeah, and something this year, something that I saw when I was doing research on different companies. I know that PayPal actually has some really great internal communication practices, and just an example when Rodney and Mike talk about the usage of video and, and the many cost-effective ways you can do it. They have something called PayPal in 60 seconds, and I thought that was really unique. It was one of the things that I talked to my manager about bringing to the Corey, in which you spend like maybe 60 seconds with the CEO or 60 seconds with human resources, and, you're really turning over to the human side of things and how people are carrying out their everyday work, in little short 60-second videos that are shared, internally at staff meetings and even shared, on your social media to share externally. So I thought that was really innovative and really creative of them to do.
And Rebecca, what about you? You get to think about this an awful lot. It's a luxury. What are some of the things you've seen out there that may be not now but soon for Kresge, things that you think are innovative and interesting?
Sure. Well, the question I hear now in internal comms is, do you even need an internet? So the assumption in the past decade was, every organization, big to small, needs to have an internet. An internet allows employees to kind of get access to information, to communicate. But a lot of organizations, and I think sometimes that challenge is all the more true with smaller organizations where folks are busy and traveling, is that internets may not be cloud-based and they're hard to access, or you start using them as kind of chat and have a chat and blog functionality, but then it doesn't really take off. And we're starting to ask the question is that what we need? Or maybe we just need to have that kind of Yammer and that chat functionality as well as some content management system. And maybe it will be internet, maybe it won't be. So we're in that process of thinking in the next couple of years of upgrading our internet and trying to decide what kind of platform will it be. And maybe it won't be the traditional platform that organizations have used in the past, because we need to ask, what does it solve for an internet? Is it that staff just want they want content management, they need access to information, and that they also want collegiality. They want to connect. They want to have fun with their colleagues, and so maybe an internet is not the best way to go about that. So we don't have an answer yet, but those are questions we're thinking about, and I've heard a lot of folks in the internal comm space ask those questions.
So we're almost out of time. I want to thank everybody for weighing in and for all the folks who participated. We got over 200 folks with us in the room. So if we didn't get to your question, I'm very, very sorry about that. We will, however, when we go ahead and advance to this next slide, we will continue the conversation in the network's members community. So if you're a Communications Network member, you can log in there, and Mike and Rebecca in particular have agreed to graciously go in there and answer any questions that you may have this week, and I think next as well. Norris West, a network board member from the Annie Casey Foundation, is serving as our guest moderator. So Norris is also going to be available to answer some of these questions. He's the Director of Strategic Communications there, and just a tremendously bright, thoughtful man. So I would encourage you to continue some of the conversations there. There's also probably a few on Twitter, and we'll try to direct Rebecca, Mike, Rodney, and Sierra there to maybe answer one or two if you've got the hashtag CommNetLive on them. I want to thank you all for joining us and let you know that we are going to have a survey that will pop up on the screen for you in just a minute's time. But two last things I want to just flag for you, doing a little bit of internal communications of my own. One is you may have been with us in Miami, in which case you saw Jake Floyd and my colleague Meredith Klein from the MacArthur Foundation and my colleague Tristan introduce the brand new Clarence B. Jones Award. This is an award that aims to celebrate and recognize communications for good that's made a difference. So really extraordinary work that's being done. And we are taking nominations now and will until the beginning of January. Alfred Ironside from the Ford Foundation and a number of other folks will be judging. And so we would encourage you to please go ahead and submit a nomination if you can. Also want to let you know on Halloween, we're going to, I guess it's kind of a day that we all try to scare ourselves if you're in the United States and you're into that thing. So we're going to talk about something that I think is on the minds of many folks and seems a little bit scary, which is dysfunction in Washington. Alexis Simendinger, who may be known to you from PBS's Washington Week. She writes the National Journal, and for Real Clear Politics, she's going to join us for about an hour. I'll be leading a conversation with her, and of course, we'll be taking your questions. You can look for an invitation to that in just the next couple of days. We do hope you'll join us. For now, we're going to say goodbye and say thank you again to Rodney and to Rebecca, to Mike, and Sierra. I certainly learned a lot. I'm really grateful, and I know the conversation on this topic will continue because it's something we have to constantly work at. And as Sierra noted, something I think we all believe, which is that organizations that communicate well are stronger, smarter, and vastly more effective. And it begins at home. It begins making sure all of our colleagues are on the same page, and that's a tremendous task that lives with almost all of us on these calls. So thanks, everybody, for participating. More soon, and we'll hope you're well. Cheers.